Hello everybody, my name is Fortifier and welcome to episode 8 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today we are talking about survival horror. This is an episode that took a little bit of time to come out. It's really my fault. We were trying to get our footing ever since I've been here in Las Vegas, and it's been really difficult trying to find the time to do it. They keep bouncing me between shifts, they keep moving me to different areas to do little pseudo deployments, to do all these other off-the-wall jobs, and sometimes that kind of catches up with the professional projects, such as this show, and ones that I do on YouTube as well, Fireside Chat and Contemporary Corner, which obviously I need to catch up and do. And I apologize for that is my fault. But today we're going to be doing a genre-based video, which is something that we haven't touched for a while. I think it was episode 2 that we talked about a genre, and that was the RPG genre. So it's been quite some time. I think we started this almost about a year ago, and obviously with time constraints, it's taken a little bit longer. But we still make these because we enjoy doing them. Survival horror is a weird one for me because I was a scared child. I didn't like horror games. Horror games fucked me over as a kid. Namely 3: Clocktower, D, and Dino Crisis. Those 3 games fucked me up. Fucked me up, jeez. Dino Crisis alone, when I went to take a shower, I'd have to check behind the curtain to make sure there's no dinosaurs there. And newsflash, there's not even any showers in the game as far as I know. I never made it that far. And then Clocktower, fucking Scissor Man popping out with his stupid little scissors, coming to get me. Hate that shit. And then D, don't even get me started on D. First time I saw a face pop out of the wall, that was it. Rip me. I still am scared of TVs that are turned off in the dark. Still to this day, because of D. And there's not even a TV in it. These are irrational fears. Whatever. Anyway, I'm not going to be doing it alone. Today I have 2 fantastic members of the Ready Go Gaming Show team. They're going to be helping me today. And they are Barley. Barley is a contemporary/retro streamer. He does whatever he wants, and he's a great content creator. Definitely check him out if you get a chance. I love hanging out with his channel. I love hanging out with his chat. He's just an awesome dude. The second streamer is Celia. Now, she doesn't stream as much as she used to, but she does do a lot of Overwatch and a lot of contemporary stuff, so definitely give her a gander if you like stuff like that. I personally don't like Overwatch, but I will personally stop by and say hello every time when she's online. But that's enough out of me. Sit back, relax, and learn a little bit about the survival horror genre.
Survival horror, the spoopiest of all spoops. The player, the enemies, the story, the emotions, a perfect combination that has dominated an entire culture of video gaming. But where does survival horror begin? Traditionally, there are 7 major genres of gaming. These include action, adventure, role-playing, strategy, simulation, and MMOs. These can be further broken down to create what we know as subgenres. For example, in the strategy genre, you can find genres such as real-time strategy, massively online battle arenas, real-time tactics, or even turn-based strategy games. So let's use strategy as an example. A great example of the strategy genre would be RTS, real-time strategy. Games like StarCraft, Warcraft, Age of Empires, and Command & Conquer are great examples of RTS. And under RTS, we have the subgenre of MOBAs, massively online battle arenas. Games like Heroes of the Storm, League of Legends, and Dota have individually dominated the MOBA subgenre for what seems like years now, with their origins traced back to custom maps in Warcraft 3 and StarCraft Brood War, making them a subgenre of RTS, which is a subgenre under strategy. Makes sense? Okay. So, following this idea of subgenre falling under a major genre, survival horror falls under the action-adventure category. There are many things that make survival horror exactly what it is. Some of it includes culture, some of it includes a cinematic spear of influence over the years. Traditionally, the key elements included limited ammunition, cryptic challenges, level design that is crafted to make you feel isolated and trapped, and the enemies? Well, they gotta be terrifying. When push comes to shove, it's all about surviving, no more, no less.
And like we mentioned before, this subgenre is inspired by more than just the concept of surviving. There's a whole separate genre for survival games. In fact, different cultures and locales lead to different concepts for how survival horror should be played out. For example, in America and Europe, most of these games revolved around the shock factor of movies, such as standards established by slasher films at the time. In the 80s, we had more than a golden age of arcades. Interestingly enough, it was also the golden age of horror movies, where film franchises such as Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, and Friday the 13th were classic solid source material for the scariest things we remember as kids. But in Japan, the cultural influence took a drastically different turn. Instead of in-your-face gore and a monster that never seemed to go away, the Japanese seemed to focus on the monster you couldn't see. Whether that was the monster in your head, or perhaps a nemesis that you don't see until the penultimate moment in the film. It was a heavily psychologically based trope that simply worked beautifully.
America's oldest origins of horror are mostly tied to books, which were the norm in the 20s. If you ever get a chance to read some of the older works by H.P. Lovecraft, you can kind of connect the dots to where some of the grotesque and shocking enemies were inspired. In terms of gaming, the first game to be considered survival horror without that name would be the 1982 Atari classic Haunted House, which was the first game to have horror elements present, with the idea of not being able to really fight these elements that were being presented to you, and since you were controlling two pairs of eyes, fighting back was impossible. It was pretty much a fetch quest, but the elements alone are perhaps one of the first examples of this genre. Now please note, this is not the first use of the term survival horror. We'll get to that in a second. Continuing the trope of early horror-based games, in the same year we saw 3D Monster Maze, featuring you, the character, attempting to escape a maze from a fucking T-Rex. Fucking T-Rex. Such a simple concept, but in those times, it was a gem. Progressing to the late 80s, Japanese video game companies made staple entries in the American and Japanese markets, focusing on the sort of horror that America was known for, the golden age of horror. Monsters such as Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Swamp Monster, and more all laid the framework for games such as Sega's Monster Bash, and more famously, Konami's Castlevania. Now bear in mind, these don't entirely fit the bill for survival horror, but they were a nice little catalyst to proving that games could be made involving these time-cherished characters. Electronic Arts would even contribute to the actual genre with Project Firestart in 1989, and this one was a science fiction game where the player controlled John Hawking on the research ship Prometheus. Basically, everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong, and everyone's totally fucked, and it's up to you to save or abandon people while escaping from the insanity the Commodore 64 was presenting in front of you, and people ate it up. It was voted as one of the greatest Commodore 64 games of all time. Tiptoeing into the 90s, we saw one of the first truly considered and defined survival horror games in the American market. It was released by the French company Infogrames, and was also the first 3D game to tackle the concept. It received numerous awards and oftentimes is considered to be the game that inspired the true first survival horror game, well, at least to be written in stone that way. What was that game? Alone in the Dark. It was a crude attempt at 3D at the time. The camera angles were janky as hell, and the controls were rather difficult to master, but regardless of this, the game was a critical success, with the atmosphere being the most praised aspect of the title. It was a staple of the genre, and the franchise itself continued making more games, with the most recent being in 2015, but we'll get to that later. But out of curiosity, what was going on in the Japanese survival horror market up to this time? Well, there's only one way to find out.
Japanese survival horror has its original roots in Japanese theater and cinema. This style of theater was a lot like kabuki, but was slightly different. It was dramatic, it focused on the mind, and it was dynamic. This would be the inspiration for a game created by Akira Takiguchi, which also took inspiration from the Alien franchise, creating Nostromo, which in theory is a lot like Project Firestart, but was on a very old Japanese computer called the PET 2001 in 1981, which was ported to older Japanese computer, the NEC PC 6001. And in 1982, we saw Bandai attempt to jump to horror with Terror House, which was a spooky game that was practically Game & Watch. So do with that what you will. Games like this were ultimately super common, as companies continued to bridge the gap to create amazing games utilizing this style. But a man known as Tokuro Fujiwara would make perhaps the largest impact in the 80s with the game Sweet Home. This game was an RPG, so again, it doesn't fit the bill, but what does fit the bill is the sheer horror themes that are present in the game. It featured enemies such as zombies, ghosts, and more. This game alone is considered to have been the framework for the entire survival horror genre, and features a team of individuals exploring a mansion to find a way out, facing tons of enemies with puzzles with the permadeath of storyline characters. Sound familiar? I promise we're getting there!
Once the 90s rolled around, we entered a time where 3D environments and characters were the norm, but there were still fantastic games rocking the 2D plane. For example, Clocktower, which is perhaps one of the most psychologically charged retro games. I remember playing it and being genuinely scared when I drive at night. I'll look back and see scissors rising from the back seat. I still kind of freak out about it to this day, but Clocktower was unique, as it was a point-and-click adventure on the SNES, but only in Japan. It painted a picture that this style of game could really be something amazing in the future.
Then we had games like D, which was a really strange, fully CGI horror game from Warp that covered topics that weren't really popular in gaming at the time, namely cannibalism and others. But 1996 would have a more interesting release, with Resident Evil, or Biohazard if you're in Japan. Resident Evil was the birth, the namesake, and the creator of the survival horror genre that we know and love today. It was the framework and template for everything that would be survival horror, leading to games such as Clocktower 2, Haunting Ground, as well as Corpse Party. Most of these are considered Resident Evil clones, but that wasn't really fair because the key tropes of survival horror are kind of irrelevant when you consider how all of these upcoming franchises put their own unique spin and lore into these games. And anyway, Capcom was leading the pack. But then Konami was all like, yo, hold on, wait. You trying to make a spooky game without telling us? And then they made Silent Hill, which is really fucking scary. And then Square was all like, hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? Not without us, all right? So they came out with Parasite Eve. And of course, Tecmo was like, oh, okay, all right, cool. We're a little bit late, but here's Fatal Frame. It was the golden age of survival horror.
The 2000s would essentially redefine everything we knew about survival horror. Not so much because of the technologies and the willingness of these companies to use them, there was just something magical about how the games were presented and their effect on us as kids. We all have memories of playing or watching somebody play Resident Evil, or even Silent Hill. We remember Freddy Krueger's face by memory and we're scared to walk the woods alone because Jason might be there. And the true beauty of the survival horror genre is that with how powerful it was in the 90s, there would be a strong ability to reuse these concepts and enhance them in the 2000s. I can't think of a franchise that didn't attempt to bridge the gap and failed immensely. For the most part, they all survived and did what they advertised, giving us an exhilarating and exciting journey through some scary fucking shit. As time went on, combat mechanics improved. The horror that we knew turned into more of an action-packed adventure with a lot of shooting, fighting, and puzzles, which is still great. Another key mechanic that began to take a rise was the use of multiplayer thanks to online servers. And with all this, we still to this day have fantastic games to accompany our memories of such a fine genre. And due to the creativity of individuals, we now have independent companies that make simply fantastic survival horror games, such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, again, using those same concepts that made survival horror what it was back in the day. Powerhouse games would come out in the early 2010s, such as The Last of Us, Slender, Cry of Fear, and even more. Because the public interest for this magnificent genre has never died, it's never yielded, and because of that, indie developers are able to make pretty much anything. The survival horror genre has stood the testament of time and embedded itself in society in a way that many other games weren't capable of doing. It exposed us to fear, it crafted our reflexes, and gave us good conversations now even as adults. It's maintained its power as a subgenre and still continues to thrive to this day. Now's the time to talk about some of the greatest survival horror games of all time. Please note, this is not an all-inclusive list, but features just some of the greatest survival horror games out there. Alan Wake is a contemporary action-adventure game, but it handles like a survival horror game. It was released in 2010 by Remedy Entertainment, which was the same company that brought us Max Payne. This game is kind of interesting, and it looks really good. Basically, you fight enemies called the Taken, which you can only interact with during the night, and they're protected by darkness, so the only way to fight them is to expose them to light and then open fire on them. The game is episodic in nature, at least in how it's presented, and seems to play almost as if you're watching an actual psychological thriller on the television. The next entry would be called Alan Wake's American Nightmare, but it's a spin-off at best. Don't be confused though, this game was still just as fantastic as the predecessor, but it didn't capture all the magic of the original entry. There was supposed to be a true sequel to Alan Wake, but it never happened. The idea was scrapped in favor of a new IP called Quantum Break. The Alien franchise has been around for a while. In fact, the games that were spawned from the franchise are incredibly memorable. 16 games have been released since 1982, but we're only going to cover the title that can be considered a survival horror entry, Alien Isolation. It was released in 2014 by Creative Assembly and published by Sega, and it's a single-player game that focuses on stealth and survival horror elements that have been the norm for the Alien franchise since the very beginning. It uses the same elements that made Alien so scary to begin with, running from xenomorphs, there's little music, and the lighting, let's just say it's a dark game. You play as Amanda, the daughter of Ripley, talk about coming full circle. And it was successful. It won a few awards such as PC Gamer's Game of the Year in 2014 and multiple awards at the 14th National Academy of Video Game Trade Reviewers. Whatever the fuck that is.
Alone in the Dark. Now this series is a classic. When you think of survival horror in the American perspective, this is where it all began, Alone in the Dark. The first game was released in 1992 by Infogrames. What a name for a company, by the way. Anyway, you can play as either Edward Carnby or Emily Hartwood, trapped inside a mansion which is haunted and full of supernatural beings. The overall objective is to escape the mansion through any means necessary. It was clunky, it was raw, it had jank-ass camera angles, it had limited inventory, and even more limited weapons. Too long, didn't read it. It was the perfect formula for a 90s survival horror game, selling 2.5 million copies by 2000. The sequel, Alone in the Dark 2, was released the following year, keeping the same formula that made the first game successful. The only major change is that instead of horror being the central viewpoint for the game, it plays much more like a standard MS-DOS action-adventure. Don't worry though, there's still spoofs galore, but not as much as the original game. It was decent, but the 3DO release, much like all 3DO games ever, was kind of rough, and the Saturn port didn't fare as well either. I mean, this game was born on the PC, and to be honest, that's where it deserved to be. Which is exactly what they did with Alone in the Dark 3, released in 1994. This game was only on the PC, and again, was the exact same game. The camera, the textures, the models, the controls, it was all the same. And for a series that was released every single year on the dot, it was starting to do the thing that hit 90s IPs really hard, running an idea into the ground. The only major difference was this time you played as Edward Carnby in the Wild West, and as a little extra tidbit of information, this game was released on a CD. What a time to be alive!
It would be 7 years before we would see another entry in the series. Behind the scenes, Infogrames, they weren't doing too hot. Essentially, during the early 2000s, they were buying up as many IPs as humanly possible. Buying Paradigm Entertainment, GT Entertainment, as well as Hasbro. And if you're familiar with Hasbro, then you know at that time they had two major companies they were controlling. Microprose, who is known for Civilization, Roller Coaster Tycoon, as well as the XCOM brands, and Atari. Well, everyone knows Atari. In 2002 alone, Infogrames had a net loss of around $65 million. With 2003 showing $89 million. Infogrames just wasn't making the cut. But returning to the game, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, which some simply just call Alone in the Dark 4, was a mainstream release that released on the PlayStation 1, Dreamcast, PS2, and the Game Boy. Oh wow, that exists. That actually exists. Anyway, the game ironically has many of the same concepts as Alan Wake, where certain enemies exist in the darkness and you're equipped with various methods of using light to combat these enemies. Also, instead of Infogrames solely making this game, it was developed by a suite of different developers. The PlayStation and Dreamcast ports were developed by Darkworks, and the PS2 port in the Windows original version was made by Spiral House, and the Game Boy Color version was made by Pocket Studios. It was an average game at best, and people dinged it for being too dark. But hey, I mean, you're alone in the dark, so yeah. It's kind of just living up to its name if you think about it. Oh, by the way, the Game Boy version actually isn't that bad. Of course, a dynamic game such as this being ported to the GBC can be somewhat problematic, but the developers handled it rather well. Many reviews say it remained faithful to the console ports.
Hallo.
Wait, what was that?
Es ist Zeit, einen Film zu machen.
Wait. Oh no, it's Uwe Boll!
Sind Sie bereit, meinen Film anzusehen?
Run! Don't look, just run! Christian Slater, what are you doing, dude? You're supposed to ride surfboards. That's Kelly Slater. Fuck, look at that. Oh God! Yeah, Uwe Boll made a movie about Alone in the Dark. It's oftentimes considered to be one of the worst films ever created, but hey, at least the game was alright.
7 years later, Alone in the Dark by Atari was released for every system imaginable, and it was the largest departure from what we knew from the series. Once upon a time, we were limited with our camera options. Now we have a free-moving camera. Back then, we were allowed to freely roam around the map and discover what the terrain had to offer, but now we had this linear-based storyline, so in essence, it was just different. People already knew that the movie that was released before was trash, so this game had big shoes to fill. And ironically it did, but it was not a good game. The most recent iteration of this game was released in 2015, but it was only an online multiplayer game. Oh well.
Amnesia. This game is a classic in a contemporary sense. It It was notorious for kicking off tons of reaction videos because it's scary as fuck. Imagine this, you have no weapons, you're afraid of the dark, you're hallucinating, and to make matters worse, Pennywise's crackhead cousins are following you and you have to hide or chuck rocks at them. But most of the time, you're hiding. The first entry, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, was released by Frictional Games, who previously made Penumbra, which was its own series of survival horror, which had a sequel and an expansion, but wasn't nearly as successful as the Amnesia series. In The Dark Descent, you play as Daniel, who has been hit by amnesia, collecting diaries in a mansion, piecing together what is happening around you, as you are haunted by the shadow and various servants of Alexander of Brennenburg, eventually making his way deep into the mansion and discovering the truth about an orb that a fellow explorer, Professor Herbert, discovered in Algeria. It was incredibly successful, with the storyline being highly praised. There was an expansion called Justine, but it was rather short compared to the original game. In the game, you choose to solve puzzles or leave people to die, so the ending is ultimately determined on you.
The sequel will be released in 2016 as Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, which took place in the same universe as the original game. But it featured a totally different cast, namely Oswald Mandus, who is the great-grandnephew of Daniel from the first entry. Oswald's trying to find a machine, and this machine is capable of producing man-pigs. Okay. Look, I'm gonna be honest. This game was not nearly as successful because they took out a lot of elements that made the first game so good. Mostly, they opted for a much more linear approach, with planned encounters galore. And people noticed that. Not to say it isn't fun, but it's definitely a step down from the original. Do you love H.P. Lovecraft? Do you like the works of the master of literary horror? Do you like evil beings with tentacles growing on their faces? Then you'll love Call of Cthulhu. But let's clarify. We're not talking about the 1981 RPG that was created by Sandy Peterson, the guy who would go on to contribute heavily to id Software. No, we're talking about the 2018 Call of Cthulhu. This contemporary release is a full-fledged adaptation of the original RPG, while being a survival horror game. It was published by Focus Home Entertainment, who is well known for various simulation games such as Cities, Cities XL, Cities XXL, and like 40 versions of Pro Cycling Manager. But more importantly, Vampire, which just released last year, which is an action RPG. Call of Cthulhu, on the other hand, was the only survival horror game that this company published. It reeks of H.P. Lovecraft lore, including such things as Necronomicon, occult rituals, various horrifying enemies from the lore, as well as, well, Cthulhu. Well, if certain conditions are met. It was an average game at best, but hey, it was nice to see some H.P. Lovecraft getting some love. But between me and you, I definitely prefer the 2005 Call of Cthulhu. Check it out if you can.
Clocktower. The first game was released by Human Entertainment in 1995 for the Super Famicom, which means this was a Japanese exclusive. Clocktower is a unique blend of point-and-click aspects covered in a nice blanket of survival horror. The sounds, the images, and the tension alone make this game a solid contender for any must-plays in the survival horror genre. The story is simple. You play as Jennifer, who gets placed in an orphanage alongside Anne and Lot, who are all adopted by Simon Barrows. Without spoiling too much of the story, let's just say from the moment the game begins, you're on the clock. Pun fucking intended. To survive and explore the mansion. This game has tons of endings and tons of ways to die. How, you ask? A fucking half pint with a massive pair of scissors. His name is Scissorman, and he likes to scissor you. Anyway, the game operated on a very small budget, but has severely large cultural impact, and when it comes to survival horror on 16-bit consoles, there isn't anything that comes close. The next game would simply be called Clocktower, but this time it was a PlayStation game that reused the concept in a 3D space with the same characters. Basically, Jessica is readopted by a criminal psychology professor in Norway, going through treatment after the terrifying events at the Barrow Mansion. But she should know by now, anytime she's adopted, shit goes haywire and Scissorman is back. This game, again, was successful, selling 500,000 copies. But there was another game that was announced during its release, Resident Evil. Whew. Thank God that came out a year later, or else this game could have been incredibly overshadowed. The next entry would come out in 1998 and was called Clocktower 2. But for all of you non-weebs that actually care about chronology, this game was known as Clocktower Ghost Head in Japan. It could have easily been called Clocktower 3, but oh well. This time you play as Alyssa Hale, who has an amulet that houses the spirit of her alter ego, Mr. Bates. Basically, in following the Clocktower tropes, there are 13 possible endings, and certain ones can only be unlocked by switching out to Mr. Bates and fulfilling certain criteria. This would be Human Entertainment's last game they ever developed, and boy did it show. This game was not a streamlined game. The music and overall sound quality, a key component in horror, was lacking, and it was a poor sendaway for such a legendary franchise.
Condemned Criminal Origins was released by Monolith Productions, who at the time had some great experience with making horror games, or at least games that were scary enough to scare me as a child. But we'll get there in a second. That franchise is a different beast. Condemned Criminal Origins was released in 2005 for all things Microsoft, and it's kind of odd. Imagine playing a horror game with some survival elements and emphasis on crime scene investigation. That's one of the reasons why I went to school for forensics. Between this and games like CSI Dark Motives, I was intrigued by finding clues and piecing together a story. Basically, the story is about a guy named Ethan Thomas who is investigating the murders of serial killer X in the town of Metro, and it's very tropey, but it handles alright. Germany, on the other hand, fucking hated it. And this game is banned in Germany because humans are injured and shit. Whatever. We won World War II. It is a very violent game, but it's horror, which, again, Germany must not like because the sequel, Condemned 2 Bloodshot, was also banned in Germany. This entry, released in 2008, was a continuation of the story with the same universe, but focuses on the investigative aspect a tad bit more than the previous one. Because of this, it plays a lot like The Evil Within, where the psychological horror is more key, but there are still moments that are incredibly violent. Check it out.
Cry of Fear. Cry of Fear is one of the first indie-styled survival horror games we will be mentioning today. It was originally a mod of Half-Life, so it maintains all of the same elements present in the game, with just horror elements. It's kind of a blend of Silent Hill meets Half-Life, and was so popular that Valve supported it, leading to it becoming a standalone title in 2013.
Oh man, this fucking game. This game terrified me as a kid. It terrified me so much, it was a game that I refused to touch for a long time. I even bought it for Barley, so I'll let him cover it.
Oh man, this one was insane. Imagine from the very beginning point of the game, you're on a timer set to die. I'm serious, this game 100% has a timer with no breaks until you die, cutscenes and all. And it's a terrifying process because there's no music, there's no scenes that are...
Laura.
Oh no.
Laura.
Oh, it's my dad and he's a vampire, I guess.
Laura, you bitch! Get out of here before I kill you in 90 minutes!
Okay, Dad. Love you, Dad. But yeah, this game was made by Warp in 1995, and it's a puzzle-heavy game that's essentially a fetch quest against the timer. But I'd say it's still worth checking out, if you can find one, of course. They're getting pretty rare nowadays.
Warp would release 2 more games, but they were only related in the sense that the main character was the same. None of these stories interconnect, but let's talk about them. The first different game would be Enemy Zero, which uses the same presentation style. You're on a space station and you must explore facing enemies along the way. You do have a weapon this time, but it takes forever to reload, on purpose, because you have to plan your shots. It was successful. The final entry would be D2, and this time it jumped to the Dreamcast exclusively. Imagine this. Laura is on a plane when a meteorite hits the plane, then boom, time to explore. This series was always known for being so random, but the idea was run dry. All in all, this strange series is worth a glimpse if you want something fun and unique.
There aren't many games on our list that have the honor of being the weird concoction of survival horror mixed with RPG. That's where Dead Island comes in. Dead Island was released in 2011, and it was pretty awesome for the time it was released. It has an exceptional open world, and the story actually makes sense. It happens on the fictional island of Benoi, where things are going great for many of the characters when, boom, zombies. You can choose from a few playable characters, and once you select them, you build up their traits and collect different weapons. It's a great game, but there's some quirks. For example, the game was glitchy, and even then, it didn't make the game unplayable. There was an expansion called Riptide, and in it was just a slight extension of the story, and it didn't really fix anything at all, so people just kind of pushed it to the side. The next game would be Escape Dead Island, released in 2014, which featured an art style that wasn't extensively used, cell shading. Bear in mind, this is the same style that Jet Set Radio and Skyward Sword used, and in my opinion, it's awesome when it's used correctly. This game was kind of bad though, mostly because it was a third-person game and the story was the only thing that kept consumers going, and the combat was pretty wacky. The final entry will eventually be Dead Island 2, but I wouldn't hold your breath. Deep Silver isn't doing too great, and key personnel are leaving. In fact, during the time of development for Dead Island 2, Deep Silver was putting out tons of focus towards Dying Light, which we'll talk about here in a second, so keep your eye out for it.
Dead Space. Dead Space is a fantastic survival horror game created by Visceral Games, which is an EA company. Dead Space was a phenomenal series with the cringe-worthy scenes that put an emphasis on the American perspective of horror. The first game was released in 2008 and is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. You play as Isaac Clarke, who is an engineer, and you must navigate the ship to escape. Over time, you'll encounter necromorphs who will fuck you up in the most creative ways imaginable if you allow them to. Ammunition is scarce, the environment is claustrophobic, and the camera can be an absolute nightmare, but the experience is presented well. The sequel, released in 2011, Dead Space 2, was a direct continuation of the storyline, keeping the same aspects of the game that made it successful before. And they did not fail to disappoint. This game was expensive to make. It had a $120 million budget, and to put that into perspective, Titanic the movie had a budget of $200 million. The final entry would be Dead Space 3, but the idea of horror was pushed to the back burner for action-based fighting, which isn't bad, it just shifts away from what consumers were used to, and they even incorporated a co-op mode. The story is kind of funky though. It takes place 200 years later, and I don't know if they ever explained how that works. And we'll probably never know because Visceral kicked the bucket in 2017.
Speaking of games that fucked me up as a kid, I borrowed this game from my neighbor and within 10 minutes was noping into the next century. It scared me so much I was afraid to close the shower curtain at night. It legitimately scared the fuck out of me. If you've played Resident Evil, then you've played this. Just add dinosaurs and a sprinkle of water and boom, Dino Crisis. You play as Regina, who must navigate a facility on Ibis Island on a Jurassic Park style adventure. It has the same controls and inventory setup as Resident Evil, but it's a nice spin. In fact, the game was released in 1999, literally 2 months prior to Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. The sequel, Dino Crisis 2, is a crazy spin on the timeline where third energy research in the previous games brings about time travel. That's right, we're headed straight into the jungle of Turok, because that's exactly what it feels like, a crazy, better rendered version of Turok. It was just as successful, but the idea was slowly starting to stagnate. Plus, the graphics are kind of weird. It seems there was focus on environment, but not the sprites themselves, and that could be exceptionally confusing. The next game was totally different. It was called Dino Stalker, and it was a light gun game following the lore of Dino Crisis. Much like the earlier games, it paralleled Resident Evil games, so this one came out around the same time that Gun Survivor was going on. You don't need a light gun to play it, but for it to be enjoyable in the slightest, you need a light gun. Sorry. The game is just poorly designed, poorly executed, and it sucked. After years of games being released on the PlayStation, they jumped to exclusively the Xbox for the final entry, Dino Crisis 3, which was released in 2003. The idea by then was so beaten to the ground that for a final entry, this was utterly disappointing. It was nothing more than a run and gun puzzle game that barely did anything for the franchise, which is probably why it died. But those memories of the early pure raw horror and dinosaurs for the early games will always be remembered.
We just talked about Dead Island a little while back, and to be honest, this 2015 first-person shooter / survival horror game might as well have been Dead Island 2. Because most, if not all, of the elements are practically the same. If they branded this game as a sequel to Dead Island, I'm sure no one would have complained, because honestly, this game is pretty phenomenal. Plus, it had a co-op mode, which means you can annihilate zombies with hammers with your friends. And the world, it's freaking huge. So definitely check this one out. Okay, it's time for a big one. Eternal Darkness. Holy crap. This game was a hit. I'm not talking about a grand slam ball out of the park hit. I'm talking about a meteor being hit by an unfathomably small ant with a massive Smash Bros. Baseball bat fully charged. This game encompasses everything that is and will ever be survival horror. This easily is the most advanced psychological thriller presented the way it is. That early in the 2000s anyway. It was a GameCube exclusive, and the best way to describe it is basically it was just a big mindfuck. Or maybe another way to describe it is Amnesia, but earlier and made by Silicon Knights. The game has you playing as a guy who explores all these mystical areas that have elements that affect your sanity. When your sanity drops, you start seeing things such as the video cutting out, hallucinations that ask you if you want to delete all your saved data, the environment will change, blood on the walls, you name it, it might happen. This is a must play on the GameCube.
Aw man, I hate this series, but people love it. I have a very specific reason for why I dislike it, and it's because the camera is so hard to control. I love the over-the-shoulder camera in Dead Space and other franchises, but for some weird reason, this game just bites when it comes to it. But other than that, this game will keep you on the edge of your seat consistently. It does it so well that you feel like you actually have to survive. I remember holding my breath sometimes while hiding. The Evil Within is 100% a psychological horror game, and it pulls it off well if you can get past the camera issues I bitched about. The game jumps between the sane realm and hallucinations, but these paths tend to cross so you don't know what's real at the end of the game. It was successful and showed that Bethesda was capable of working with horror. The sequel is a tad bit better with the camera, the visuals, and the atmosphere, and all the same things that were popular with the previous game still remained. When you think of Tecmo, you probably don't associate it with horror at all. In fact, you probably think of Dead or Alive, Dynasty Warriors, Monster Rancher, or Ninja Gaiden. But they did have a rather popular game series called Fatal Frame. Much like every horror game ever, it takes place in a mansion, but the kicker that makes this game so unique is that you get to see ghosts that you have to use a camera to capture, which sets up the player to experience some badass jump scares that are used effectively. It wasn't commercially successful in Japan, but it was cherished by the US and European markets, and even though it didn't really make the grade, it set the framework for future entries in the series, specifically Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly, which is oftentimes considered to be one of the scariest games ever made. Again, you play as a young female who's exploring a ghost town, and by using the camera obscura, you can capture and combat ghosts. The story does differ a little though, but that's fine because the game is fucking terrifying, so you're not really thinking of lore as much as you would think, everything else. The game has multiple endings and was successful, leading to the third entry in the series, Fatal Frame 3, The Tormented. Again, you're using the same camera with the same storyline from the previous game with the same idea. Yeah, it's the same game. It's just different characters in different location. But it was still good. It just seemed like Fatal Frame was able to reuse the same idea multiple times because the experience alone was what led to the title being successful. Kind of like the Saw movies. I don't think anybody ever watched Saw for the plot, but instead watched it for the death traps. True story. The next game was called Zero Tsukihami no Kamen, or Mask of the Lunar Eclipse. In Japan, Fatal Frame was known as Project Zero. Much like Resident Evil was called Biohazard, it was a Wii entry and gave the player what seemed to be greater control of the camera. It followed the story of a suspected serial killer and has you playing various characters who were affected by this guy in some capacity. But again, it was only in Japan, so you're gonna have to emulate this one. It is the best-selling entry in the franchise after all, so give it a shot. The final game was released in 2014 as Project Zero Maiden of the Blackwater for the Wii U, again using the Wii U hardware as a great way to attack ghosts. There was a spin-off called Spirit Camera, The Cursed Memoir, and it's kind of fucking creepy. Imagine shooting ghosts in the real world. Yeah, that's good for like 10 minutes. I think it's kind of old, but hey, it's not so bad.
Next up, we got Fear. We mentioned Monolith Studios earlier, the people who made the Condemned games, and Blood as well, which is fantastic. Fear isn't really a survival horror game, but, you gotta survive and it has horror elements, so screw it. Fear stands for First Encounter Assault Recon, and it follows a supernatural special forces team that has to contain a threat. The threat being Alma, who is controlling the main antagonist, Paxton Fattel, who essentially has become a psycho terrorist. Throughout the game, Alma messes with you and you have to shoot people, and that's pretty much it. There were some more expansions for this game called Extraction Point and Perseus Mandate. They added some unique plot points. But overall, the main game was where it was at. The game was pretty good, and honestly, the atmosphere took the cake for a Windows-based horror game at the time. The sequel, Fear 2 Project Origin, brought back all the mechanics from the first game to include the story of Alma pretty much chewing up and spitting out all that is reality. The final entry is Fear 3, which added co-op, where you could play as either Point Man, the unnamed protagonist from Fear 1 and 2, or Paxton Fattel with his psychic powers. It also has some kick-ass multiplayer modes, for example, Contractions, which is pretty much COD Zombies, or Soul Survivor, where it's kind of like Killing Floor. Then you have Soul King, where you have to outlive all your friends. Basically, you collect souls. The final multiplayer mode is called Fucking Run. Yep, it's called Fucking Run, and it involves you running from a wall of death. Not to be confused with a mosh pit wall of death, this is legitimately a wall of death rushing towards you, so you gotta fucking run. The series is honestly really good though. I definitely recommend it, especially if you're more into fighting back against the enemies than running from them, then you definitely want to check this series out.
This series is a cult classic, if not for the lore that was created bit in piece, but for the YouTube culture that it created. Much like Slenderman and other horror games, this one led to the birth of the theory channels on YouTube. Sure, Game Theories was around for a while, but without them, the storyline would be a confusing mess that would leave you begging for more. It was all the brainchild of Scott Cawthon, who used to make religiously charged games, and people used to make fun of him, saying that his character models were static and stiff like animatronics. Well, that led to the inspiration to create Five Nights at Freddy's, the first game that was released in 2014, and it was rather simple. You sit in a chair, you have 2 doors, and 2 lights, and you have to observe the cameras to keep 4 animatronics, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, Foxy the Fox, and Freddy the Bear, from sneaking up and scaring the ever-living fuck out of you. You also have to check the cameras, but don't do it too often because it consumes electricity. We aren't going to get into the plot here because it's so convoluted, but just know that this game is fantastic. The sequel was Five Nights at Freddy's 2, which upped the difficulty tremendously and featured a few newer animatronics. This time, you had to keep a music box wound while also using a mask to protect yourself if the animatronics popped up in front of you. Additionally, you had to use a flashlight. Much like the previous game, it was exceptionally well received. Then came Five Nights at Freddy's 3. Which is kind of an odd one in the family. It was dropped suddenly almost without any warning and only featured hallucinations and one major enemy, Springtrap. You had to use audio cues to keep him away and prevent him from entering the maintenance tunnels. This game was a tad bit stupid, but to be honest, it was exceptionally lore heavy, with hidden minigames and more. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 would be released in 2015 and was advertised as the final chapter, much like Friday the 13th, but this was far from the case. It takes place in a child's bedroom, and you must rely heavily on audio clues to determine if the enemies are at the door or down the hall. In addition to that, it adds a tad bit more lore than before. It was an acceptable addition to the storyline after 3, which kinda was lacking. Then we had a far left field game called FNAF World, Five Nights at Freddy's World, which was an RPG. There were moments where the lore leaked through, but it was its own game. It was kinda buggy too. When I played it, it crashed about 4 times, which was shitty. Scott's website was always known for the hub for teaser images to tease the next game. Then out of nowhere, the images just stopped. After a while, they came back with 14 blurred dashes. Over time, these slowly spelled out Sister Location, which was the name of the 5th main storyline game to be released. This time it was based more on mini-games and there were multiple endings. FNAF 6 was originally made as a joke game, at least that's what people thought it was before it came to light that this was actually no bullshit a FNAF game, with business simulation elements. Then came Ultimate Custom Night, which brought in 61 different animatronics from the entire series. As a spin-off, it wasn't bad, but I personally haven't played it. I might get into the FNAF games again when Halloween rolls back around again, but other than that, I have no intentions of doing this. There were some books, and there just recently was a game released called Five Nights at Freddy's VR Help Wanted, where you can do 40 different minigames all tying in the story, and in VR.
Friday the 13th, the game. We all remember the movies. We even remember the NES game that was a cult classic from LJN. But when they started talking about making a contemporary game, many of us had our doubts. Turns out, it's pretty fucking good, and tons of people stream it. In a minimum format, you play as a counselor trying to escape Jason in as many creative ways as possible, with someone else being Jason. He has tons of abilities to kill you, and you're left to your devices to escape him. Since its release, they've added scenarios and minigames, and it's worth checking out. It's a nice nod to the classic horror franchise. Layers of Fear. This game is a psychological horror game created by Bloober Team. Yeah, that's their name. Bloober Team. Boober Team would have been more fun. Basically, the story is you're an obsessed and psychologically disturbed painter who is trying to figure out how to finish his painting. There's tons of puzzles and tons of jump scares. Also, if you're scared of mannequins, then boy, are you in for a treat. Left 4 Dead is Valve's take on the genre, but it again isn't really a survival horror game per se, but you survive alongside your friends. If you have any friends. Maybe you're fucking irritating and don't have any friends, maybe you need to reevaluate your life choices. I heard farmersonly.com is a great place to find teammates for Left 4 Dead. But yeah, you basically survive an onslaught of zombies at all times with 3 other bots or teammates. The campaign is solid, but the multiplayer aspect is what this game is really known for. The only continuation of this series was Left 4 Dead 2, which is the same game, and it was approached the same way by consumers. Both were extremely successful. Though, there has been some major rumors about a Left 4 Dead 3, and it has been in some of their background. program information. Just so you know. Sorry I snuck this in here, Fort.
Little Nightmares is a contemporary horror game where you control Six, a young girl who is starving, and yeah, she explores around and generally fucks things up, but I digress. It's a must-play title from Tarsier Studios, who were previously known for the Little Big Planet series.
Lone Survivor. Lone Survivor is a gorgeous indie 2D survival horror game released back in 2014. You play as an individual that hallucinates in a post-apocalyptic world. You have to eat, you have to sleep, and, well, you gotta live. This game balances it all very well, including multiple endings and more, so definitely check this one out.
Outlast. You like scary games? You like playing as a video journalist with only a camera while naked men chase you down the street? You want to play a game where dicks are more common than blades of grass? Outlast is for you. This game is violent, it's got weenies, it's insane. You play as Miles Upshur, who is investigating a psychiatric hospital where everyone hates you and knows your name. It's like Cheers, but everyone is a pissed off Ted Danson chasing after you. This game was immensely successful, selling roughly 4 million copies as of 2016. Then came Whistleblower, which was a DLC, but it barely bridged the gap and set us up for Outlast 2, which is another mindfuck of a horror game where you're stuck in the Supai region of Arizona. But it might as well be Alabama because everybody's fucking each other. True story. Incest is a huge part of this. Basically, you and your wife crash and land in a cultist area called Temple Gate, where they burn all their kids in a religious cult kind of way. It's a trip. Play it though.
I've never played this, but I've heard it's pretty good, and to really understand it, you need to read the book Parasite Eve, as the novel itself is a full-fledged prequel to the PS1 entry. Square made this, and it's an action RPG, but the whole survival horror element of this game is owed in part to the novel itself, which is a science fiction-based horror book. If you've ever played Vagrant Story, the combat system is very similar. It has a sphere of influence and an active timer bar that determines when you attack and how you attack. There's tons of status effects, and honestly, it's your run-of-the-mill RPG with a very unique and appealing horror element. It also has a banging soundtrack. The sequel, Parasite Eve 2, took place 7 years after the original entry, but many people felt that the control scheme was outdated. But don't let that dissuade you from trying the game. Again, it has very strange elements, much like Vagrant Story, where certain affinities affect enemies. I personally just beat Dot Hack about 2 weeks ago, so I'm personally familiar with that style of effectiveness. It's not too bad, but kinda gets annoying after a while. Another fun fact is that the guy who made Resident Evil worked on this one, so the standard was there from the beginning. The final entry, called The Third Birthday, is a PSP exclusive that ties into the Parasite Eve universe, but was kind of a reimagining of the storyline. Because of this, people tended to judge the game. That and the combat was slightly different, seeming to be an action-adventure kind of thing, but we'll leave that to you. We already covered this fantastic horror series in the first ever episode of the Ready Go Gaming Show when we talked about Capcom. Because of this, we aren't going to go back and cover it. But just know that Resident Evil is the reason why survival horror was coined as a term. It set the framework for over 2 decades of survival horror. To this day, the original Resident Evil trilogy has been a rite of passage for numerous gamers, being challenged by really nothing else other than Silent Hill. For all intents and...
Fort, you can't not talk about Resident Evil.
You know what? Screw it. Let's go. Resident Evil is Capcom's primary take on the survival horror genre and was inspired by a 1998 horror game by the name of Sweet Home. In fact, the first Resident Evil game was supposed to be a remake, but for licensing reasons, things fell through. If you've ever played Sweet Home, then you'll recognize a vast majority of the elements that bled over, and it was done very well. In the first game, Resident Evil, you could play as either Jill Valentine, the far superior choice, or Chris Redfield, the far less superior choice. And you were charged with finding other STARS members and escaping from the mansion while discovering the twisted truth of the experimentation and the birth of the T-Virus by the Umbrella Corps. From the initial release, which was exceptionally successful, pinning the survival horror name permanently, we saw 2 revisions of the original game. The first was Director's Cut, which had an arranged version that acted as a randomizer for the items in the game, as well as uncensored intros depending on which console or platform you played on. The second revision was Director's Cut DualShock version, which supported the DualShock analog controls, which made for a more smooth playthrough given the stiff tank controls and the daunting camera. The Saturn version was known for adding an additional battle and different encounters, and the Windows version was the one that contained the unedited and uncensored FMVs. In the handheld spectrum, there was supposed to be a Game Boy port, but it was cancelled, mostly in part to the limited capabilities of the Game Boy. But there was a Resident Evil Game Boy game released, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The DS also got an interesting port called Deadly Silence, which incorporates elements that were added in the future. For example, the turning around quickly, which was added in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and the quick reload found in Resident Evil 4. In 2002, we saw a remake of the original game for the GameCube. It was smoother, the controls were better, and overall, this version is a blast to play if you get the chance. I believe that this is the same game found in Resident Evil Origins, so check it out if you want, but if you really needed a contemporary remake of this game, look no further than a remake in 2015 that shook the world and dramatically changed the direction of the game, showing the potential to remake all of these older games into beautiful ones that rekindle the interest of the original trilogy.
The sequel to the original game would come out in 1998, featuring Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield. Set 2 months after the events of the original game, basically, Raccoon City is fucked. Most of the game takes place in the Raccoon City Police Department. But as you explore and get deeper and deeper into the secrets of the new virus, the G virus, also fun fact, the original build at RE2 was actually scrapped about a year before the final version was released. They just weren't happy with it and they decided to start from scratch again. But I'm not complaining because honestly, the Resident Evil 2 we got, in my opinion, is one of the best games ever made. Even if the version I played was the N64 version.
Alright, I know what you're thinking. Resident Evil 2 on the N64? Yeah, it's pretty much how it sounds. But, to be fair, the port wasn't that bad, considering the limitations that they had to work with.
Anyway, the game was simply fantastic, and it was a jump forward for the franchise. The atmosphere, the story elements, it all came back just as strong, if not stronger than before. Recently, there was a remake created and it was met with critical acclaim. Sure, some elements were improved and storyline elements were tweaked, but that's the beauty of these remakes. They allow you to go back and totally re-envision something that you might not have been able to pull off back in the day.
The next game would be Resident Evil 3 Nemesis in 1999, which follows the story of Jill Valentine 24 hours prior to the events of the previous game. Raccoon City is in shambles, and there's a team of Umbrella guys trying to fuck up the entire town before their secret gets out. The kicker for this game is that this mouth breather called Nemesis that can only say stars, like a more enhanced Groot, with this weird tentacle porn fingers, comes out and chases you for all eternity. Also, instead of making the character explore to unlock different endings such as rescuing your teammates in the previous games, Resident Evil 3 features physical choices that you can make occasionally in the game that determine the path you take. Some of the choices are slightly simple, changing the course of combat versus escape from Nemesis, while the others directly impact the final boss fight. It was met with critical acclaim and is the last major fantastic game in the OG trilogy.
The next entry would be a major departure from the series with a light gun entry called Resident Evil Survivor. Well, you could use a light gun or you could use a controller, which for me is nice because I'll likely never be able to stream light gun games, but I can at least continue with playing this game, which I'm not looking forward to because it sucks. Consumers were used to the old style Resident Evil, and the first-person shooter was not on that consumer's agenda. Oh well. At least in 2000 they returned to what they knew with Resident Evil Code Veronica. This game followed Chris and Claire Redfield, and it's a definite smash hit. The game was a beautiful and great continuation of the main storyline. I personally look forward to playing the Dreamcast variants myself, but I might play the enhanced version, Code Veronica X. In 2001, the series would jump to the Game Boy Color, as we mentioned earlier, with Resident Evil Gaiden. You wouldn't think initially that a Game Boy Resident Evil game was possible, but to be honest, this one pulled it off very well. You control Leon Kennedy, who is investigating a viral outbreak on a cruise ship, and you have Barry Burton in tow. You meet other characters, and then from that point on, the fun begins. It operates from a top-down perspective, but when the combat comes, it changes to first-person perspective, with a little bit of a minigame. It's definitely worth a shot.
You would think with all the mixed love towards the Survivor entry that they wouldn't make another one, right? Well, they did. It was called Resident Evil Survivor 2, Code Veronica, which is confusing as hell. I'm not gonna lie, that's really confusing. But it sort of ties in with the story of Resident Evil 2 and 3, and it has a story mode as well as an arcade mode. Generally, it operated a bit better than the first Survivor entry, but it was sort of a wonky game. Well, what do we do? Do we release Resident Evil 4? The game that people wanted for a while? How about a prequel instead? That's what Resident Evil 0 did in 2002. This game is awesome. You play as Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen in tandem. That's right, in tandem. As in, at the same time. And for once, the AI isn't totally garbage. In fact, you can change between the two at pretty much any given time. You can even ask them to split up to explore. The game is simply fantastic and an excellent prequel to one of the most influential survival horror games of all time. The game is also remastered and can be found on the Resident Evil Origins collection. Ever hear of Dead Aim? Yeah, that's a Resident Evil game. In fact, it's a light gun Resident Evil. I guess Zero quenched the thirst of players long enough for Capcom to get back to hitting the experimental games. So imagine this. You take Resident Evil Gaiden and then you make it contemporary. Because that's exactly what it is. It's also the first game to allow for the players to aim and move at the same time. Something that was never incorporated until Dead Aim. Also, you play in a third-person perspective. Until it's time to shoot, then it switches to first person. Pretty cool, huh? Well, sales didn't reflect that, unfortunately. Well, time to make another main series entry.
Which is exactly what they did. Oh no they didn't. What's this? Resident Evil Outbreak? What the hell? This game takes place in the same time frame as 2 and 3, much like Survivor 2, and allows you to complete 5 different scenarios, which you can play in any order. They don't tie in together. It also is subpar, but hey, that's how the community approached non-mainstream RE titles at the time. But that didn't faze Capcom. They released Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 soon after. Oh, and this game was the first Resident Evil game to support online multiplayer. It doesn't work now, so don't even bother trying. But if you want a decent co-op game that's part of the Resident Evil family, check out these 2 games.
In January of 2005, Resident Evil 4 would finally come out, featuring a familiar face in Leon S. Kennedy. I personally owned this one for the Wii, and it was my first Resident Evil game I ever played and beat. This game was amazing, the atmosphere was perfect, and the controls were fantastic because I could use the Wiimote to literally aim wherever I wanted to. It taught me to appreciate where Resident Evil started from and inspired me to go back and play them. This one even had minigames, and while I didn't understand the canon at the time, I had a blast playing it. By the way, the next game was also on the Wii, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles, which was like a rail shooting game, which like most rail shooters followed a predetermined path, much like House of the Dead, but this game had scenarios that were from all of the original games, which was pretty cool. The next entry would be the most spotlighted Resident Evil game of all time, 5. The reason was mostly racially related, but I'm not going to get into that here. You play as Chris Redfield or Shiva Alamoran. You're exploring Kajuju to find Ricardo Irving, who is selling a bioorganic weapon on the black market. It was one of the top-selling games in Japan in 2009, selling 319,590 copies in the first 2 weeks. It would even become the fastest-selling game across all the consoles in the UK. In fact, up until the release of Monster Hunter World, it was the highest-selling Capcom game of all time.
What big shoes to fill. Let's make another Chronicles entry with the Dark Side Chronicles. Don't knock it though, this game actually kept the same energy as Umbrella Chronicles and told stories from Code Veronica, which outside of Resident Evil Survivor 2 was never really touched. For the first time in a long time, Capcom decided to push a 2011 release of Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D on the 3DS, which had a bunch of playable characters including Hunk. And if you've ever played Resident Evil 4 or 5, you might remember the Mercenaries minigame. Well, this is it, just on a smaller scale. And it's awesome. In the next year, we would see the release of Resident Evil Revelations, which brought back fan favorites Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. And for the first time in the franchise, the game focused more on survival more than anything else. There are plenty of times where you could be left without ammo and it's up to you to survive. The game bridges the gap between Resident Evil 4 and 5, and it was thought to be a fine mixture of old school mixed with new school.
Capcom was doing a great job keeping the IP afloat. After all, many of the franchises that began in the 90s more often than not had difficulty jumping into the contemporary spectrum. But not Capcom. Capcom did a fantastic job of keeping the idea fresh, while still managing to incorporate key plot points from the franchise, which is what they did in 2012 with Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City. It's a non-canon game, but don't discredit it. You can play as 12 different characters from the series, and has various game modes. But the story takes place between Resident Evil 2 and 3. It sold 3.2 million units. Later that year, Resident Evil 6 would come out, which was fine and all, but didn't feel like a true Resident Evil game. In fact, it felt more like a spooky shooter. Much like the previous games that were spin-offs and side stories, this one allowed for you to play 4 different scenarios with 4 different people: Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Jake Moeller, and Ada Wong. Additionally, people can join you to help you online at any time. It was successful, but to be honest, outside of the story, it was kind of a shitty departure for the series. Given the success of Revelations, Capcom made the decisions to make another Revelations game that, again, had 4 episodes. But it sometimes got a bit laggy. Most of the time though, it operates like it's supposed to. Some people just gloss over it because of the technical issues it had at release, but to each their own. This game can hold its own weight in the franchise.
Capcom did pretty much everything with their IP except for music games. Characters from the RE franchise would show up in fighting games as well as Easter eggs in other games. But the one thing they hadn't touched yet was a multiplayer tactical shooting game, which is exactly what Umbrella Corps was. And it was absolute dog shit. Imagine Call of Duty or Rainbow Six, well the newer ones, with a Resident Evil sticker slapped right on top of that bad bitch. The most recent game was Resident Evil 7, and holy shit was it a landmark title. You play as Ethan Winters in the first person perspective, exploring a house to find his missing wife. And as you could guess, shit goes insane rather quickly. This game is pure horror through and through, and seems excessively linear. It even had a VR mode, which was fucking insane. Definitely check this game out. If you like Saw, then more than likely you won't like the games. After all, most major movies during the 2000s saw in some capacity a video game release that paralleled it. Saw, the video game, takes place between the first and second films and follows Detective Trapp, who is still obsessed with finding the Jigsaw Killer. There are tons of puzzles, but the game can be difficult sometimes. When compared to the other titles, it isn't the greatest, but I had a fun time playing it, so check it out. It was followed up with Saw 2 Flesh and Blood, which follows the son of Detective Trapp, and I really don't want to ruin the story, but there's a canon ending that sets up this game, which sucked. It was really shitty. I hated playing this game because it was essentially a dumbed down copy clone with forced puzzles that were horrendous. There are two endings, and you have to make the choice really early in the game, and if you aren't expecting it, you get an underwhelming ending that does not leave you craving for more. This is an off-brand game based on a movie franchise, so if you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't.
Silent Hill. If Myst can be called Myst, what the fuck does this switch do? Then Silent Hill easily can be called Silent Hill, where the fuck do I go? This game is cryptic as shit, and it's a rite of passage for horror enthusiasts. The first game was released by Konami in 1999, simply called Silent Hill, and it is oftentimes considered another of the greatest games ever made, not only in general, but also as a staple of the survival horror genre. You play as Henry Mason, who has stepped out of the year and lost his daughter in a city full of a cult that's performing horrible rituals. It's basically a different spin on Resident Evil, but we can't really say what we think is better. That's totally up to you. But what we can say is that the atmosphere is phenomenal, and that's what makes it different from Resident Evil. It's not so much about fighting as much as it is about solving puzzles and the few enemies that sometimes pop up. It was critically successful. The next game, Silent Hill 2, is yet again considered another greatest of all time, and it delivered with the same power as the first entry, and this time follows the story of Husband of the Year, James Sutherland, who comes to the shittiest city in America, Silent Hill, which now changes depending on the perspective of the character. Apparently, James has some personal demons. The game saw many versions and re-releases, one of which had an extended story called Born from a Wish, where you play as Maria, which is a character James meets. And we don't want to spoil any story elements, just know it's fucking emo as hell.
The third entry in the series features Daughter of the Year Heather Mason, who is the daughter of Father of the Year Harry Mason, who was the protagonist of the first game 17 years ago in the story's plot. The game, it was exactly the same. We hate to break it to you, but they all really are, with only slight variations, which is the same formula that Resident Evil kept, but the universe for RE seemed a little bit more, practical. Plus, this game suffered with its camera and controls, but the production value was through the roof on how it was presented. The fourth entry is called Silent Hill 4: The Room, and for the first time in all these games, it doesn't feature anything special. It's just a guy named Henry Townsend. I think they're convinced that there are only two male names ever in the history of horror, James and Henry. Anyway, he's exploring South Ashfield, which is a definite departure from what was the norm, and he's trying to escape. Wait, you fucking...
He's trying to escape his apartment, Fort. That's exactly what it is.
Some people liked it, some people hated it. There's moments that are reminiscent of the early titles, and there's some moments where people wondered what the hell they were thinking. It was a glorified fetch quest with horror elements, which to be fair, so was Resident Evil, but this was years ago. Silent Hill 4 came out in 2004. Plus the graphics were annoying sometimes, like they didn't even want to be there. The next entry was Silent Hill's origin, as if Silent Hills 2 wasn't a good enough backstory for establishing the crazy bullshit that is Silent Hill. We return back with Travis Grady at the helm because he's Good Samaritan of the Year. Like always, the game switches back and forth between the other world more like Stranger Things, and the player explores repressed memories of his fucked up childhood. Same formula, same everything, but hey, it worked because it was extremely successful. Then we moved on to Brother of the Year with Silent Hill Homecoming, which again was the same game as always, and this time we play as Alex Shepard, who gets a ride from Travis Grady, from Origins, and he has to find his little brother and deal with a cult. A cult, the city, and his own past, because he's special forces, and he's coming home from war. Oh, and he's banned in Germany because it's too violent. Shocker. The next game was Silent Hill Shattered Memories, and it's a remake of the first. Crazy thought. How about a game that isn't exactly the same game? But to be fair, it was an impressive update. Instead of a third-person camera, we have my least favorite camera, the over-the-shoulder shot, which is frustrating to say the least. The final game was Silent Hill Downpour, released in 2012, and features Murphy Pendleton. It was kind of subpar.
In conjunction with the 8 console releases, we saw some of the off-the-wall Silent Hills, such as Silent Hill the Arcade, which was not even an arcade game, just the arcade, which was a rail shooter exclusively made for Japanese and European markets. It's a glorified House of the Dead. Or Silent Hill Orphan, which is about Ben. It's also a mobile game, as was the next game, Silent Hill the Escape. And of course, with any older games that keep coming out of their hidey holes in the 2000s, there was a Silent Hill HD collection that was released in 2012 containing Silent Hill 2 and 3. If you're hoping to play Silent Hill 1 remastered, you better play Shattered Memories because that's the closest thing you're going to get. And it's not that bad, honestly. The next game was Silent Hill Book of Memories, and it's a hack and slash. So imagine Devil May Cry, but instead it's a class-based hack and slash like Gauntlet, but with a subpar story. And it's on Vita. Now, I'm not going to knock the PS Vita, but they could have easily made a Silent Hill-style game on the Vita. It was more than capable, but that's just an opinion. Then came PT. What does PT stand for? Playable Teaser. But it was so much more than that. PT was a vision. PT was a hope for a future of horror games. PT was a free game, and it was supposed to be some sort of hint to a future Silent Hill game. But it's a standalone in its own right, and people recognize that. From start to finish, PT is a terrifying game that has some sort of hyper-realistic elements due to Guillermo del Toro helping out Hideo Kojima. It was an endless loop of spooper-dupers, and when it came to fruition, well, you can experience that for yourself. That's if you can find a console with it installed, as it kind of got taken off the PlayStation Store thanks to Konami. Thanks, Konami! Kojima was supposed to make another game using this PT style called Silent Hills, but it was canned when Konami shot itself in the foot and then Kojima left. Luckily, we are getting something out of it. Kojima and Del Toro are actually continuing to work together on a game called Death Stranding, which is looking pretty good so far, so here's hope it turns out to be good. Next up, we got Siren. Siren is a terrifyingly amazing survival horror series that was born on the PS2 in 2003 in Japan, in 2004 in the US and PAL regions. It takes place in the village of Hanuta, where the enemies are roaming around being sketchy as hell. The real kicker about this game, though, that makes it stand out more than anything, is the ability of the main character to sight jack. A psychic ability that lets you see inside the head of enemies who are chasing you. This can make your gameplay experience be exceptionally unnerving as you hide and hold your breath just watching these enemies slowly creep around searching for you. The game handles this so phenomenally, so high five Sony for that one. The sequel Forbidden Siren 2, or simply Siren 2, was released in 2006 and follows the same format where you have puzzles and hiding mechanics that make the game unnerving. The major improvements is that you are alerted earlier to enemy presence, interactions with items are significantly easier, and they even threw in some Alan Wake Darkness boys that you have to use light to destroy. It wasn't bad, but it was average compared to its predecessor. But the next one? Oh man, Blood Curse? Best ever. Hands down best. This game is a reimagining of the original entry and they do it awesomely. So check it out if you get a chance.
Slender. It's time to talk about the Slenderman, the YouTube phenomenon creepypasta that potentially kicked off more YouTubers into popularity than potentially Five Nights at Freddy's and Amnesia combined. This game was the indie game of its time, around 2012. Everyone loved it, and people shit their pants when old Slenderman came hobbling around. The first game was created by Parasite Productions and was based on Marble Hornet's YouTube series, which drove the entire lore of Slenderman. In this game, You have to find 8 pages while trying to keep Slendy from fingering your butthole, and he goes deep. It was minimalistic at first, and because of that, it became a cult classic. The next entry, Slender the Arrival, was a mainstream title by Blue Owl Studios that was an updated version of the 8 pages with better graphics, more hints into the storyline, and it is spoopy. The final 2 games were iOS games, so they didn't really hold a candle to the previous 2. They're more like a subpar Flash game. So if you want the real experience, play 8 pages or The Arrival.
Soma is the most recent game released by Frictional Games, the same people who brought us Amnesia and Penumbra. And much like those games, this one focuses heavily on the psychological horror aspects. This means the environment is mostly your enemy. The atmosphere, the sounds, the visuals, they all combine to form this beautiful trifecta of horror that in of itself is the purest form of horror. Soma takes place in Pathos 2, which is an underground facility in the North Atlantic Ocean. Basically, there's an AI and apocalyptic themes, and you just gotta play it. It's something we can't really describe in a simple paragraph.
System Shock. When you think of System Shock, you likely don't think of survival horror, mostly because it's an FPS. Well, that's true for the first one, which was released in 1994, but the sequel took a significantly different perspective on it as an FPS RPG with survival horror elements. Many of these elements involve atmosphere and ghosts appearing, but for the most part, it's minimal. But that didn't stop it from being critically hailed as one of the greatest games of all time.
The Last of Us is an amazing game that was released in 2013 with beautiful, outstanding graphics, a storyline that will simply bring you to tears, as well as music and sound design that keeps you drawn in. Naughty Dog really pulled all the stops to make sure that this game was an experience like no other, and it really shows. The story follows Joel and Sarah surviving in a dystopian future where a fungus decimates the population, and martial law has essentially been declared. It's hard to describe this one in any capacity without spoiling the story, but just know that this is a must play. Also, it's been announced that part 2 is coming soon, so keep your eyes peeled.
This game is mostly a third-person shooter, but the survival horror comes from the sheer gore and violence that it contains. This game 100% was based on the psychology and the morality of the protagonist, who essentially can become the antagonist depending on choices made throughout the game. The sequel, The Suffering, the Ties That Bind, was released in 2005 and was criticized for being the exact same game with minimal changes. But that doesn't mean it's not worth playing. If you like super violent games, then honestly, this is probably going to be up your alley.
There are far too many games that are part of the Walking Dead TV series to mention. As with every great show comes a video game in some, format, and for the interest of this episode, we're going to be talking about the Telltale episodic series that started with the story of Clementine. Now, this game, for all intents and purposes, is not a survival horror game, but there are choices you must make to determine what happens, and with that comes psychological impact. In fact, choices are the key part of this game, which is something I enjoy because when you involve the element of choice and incorporate consequence and reward with said choices, it brings a whole different level of mental investment in the game series. All in all, there are 4 major seasons released with 1 spin-off.
Until Dawn. Speaking of games that involve choice, Until Dawn is a perfect example of a contemporary approach to this style of gameplay. Basically, the story is that you control 8 young adults who have to survive until dawn. Pretty simple, right? Well, there's tons of choices, tons of enemies, and your choices directly impact people, such as the permanent loss of party members, and in the event that they do die, the storyline molds and changes. For the minimal marketing that Sony did for this game, the effect was massive. There was a spin-off called Rush of Blood, which is a PSVR game that is a rail shooter. It is scary as shit. Just has Fortifier and Scooty. In 2018, the prequel The Impatient was created, which is a first-person survival horror game that is set 60 years prior to Until Dawn, and it's basically a VR version of Amnesia, with all the elements that made Until Dawn a success.
That was a great episode. I enjoyed making that. It was kind of tough though, because survival horror has its roots in very tropey, kind of gimmicks, right? So instead of it just being a scary game with guns and monsters, there's very strict criteria for what operates as a survival horror game. Now, all things considered, all of the games that we listed here today are just from random lists of best ofs, if you can imagine that. So we take the best ofs, and then we go back and we pick every game in that franchise, talk about it from start to finish, and I like to think that this episode is pretty cool. I'd love to thank Barley and Celia for taking the time out of their respective days to help me accomplish this episode. Next episode, we're going to be talking about Activision. And this is actually going to be a two-part episode. We're going to be talking about Activision, and the episode that comes out immediately after is going to be Blizzard, but we're going to try to do it in such a way where the two episodes come out either on the same day, and it's like a double feature, or something a tad bit different. Hopefully it'll be out before Christmas, or Halloween, or Thanksgiving. I'm hoping it'll be out soon. But from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Ready Go Gaming Show, out.